What about trade to and from the northern regions to China in the early Common Era? Here it's very important to note that most of the trade between the Roman Empire and China, at least the second part of it, was still very much an overland affair, which is indicated on this map very, very clearly. We know from some Han Dynasty sources that they were aware of a sea route, but we also know from those sources that they didn't make use of it very often, that they tried, but they didn't continue, and therefore really utilized the overland route through the Taklamakan Desert area to get to move products to Central Asia and then further south. Where did this trade connect? Right? This trade that was coming from the north, that was moving across the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean and Roman Egypt. Well, there are two ports, really. Barbaricum, or Babarikon. In Greek, it would be Babarikon. In Roman, in Latin, it would be Babarikun, which is right down on the coast of modern-day Pakistan near the mouth of the Indus River. And then the second one was a site called Barigaza, which is modern Bharuch in the state of Gujarat. Those were the two very important trading posts for trade with the northern region. And how do we know that? Well, simply by looking at the exports and imports at these two sites. So here, Babarikam, right? Here the imports, you have thin clothing, you have figured linens, you have topaz, coral, storax, frankincense, which was coming from Arabia at that time, vessels of glass, right? Romans exported their glassware overseas to the west coast of India and southern coast of Pakistan. You have silver and gold plate, wine, a little. Perhaps there was no real market for wine. In fact, there's a lot of archaeological evidence now, or at least an hypothesis, that a lot of the amphorae that carried wine were brought by merchants themselves for their own consumption. And also the olive oil, because they like to cook with the olive oil. You don't see wide-scale distribution of that wine in other parts of India. So they probably figured we're going to be there for 3 months, might as well be a happy 3 months while we're waiting for the winds to go back. So that was coming in to Babarikam, and then you look at exports. So you have costas, and I provided some modern images just so you get a sense of what it is. They're spices, vegetal substances, and also precious stones. Nard, and then turquoise, which comes from Afghanistan and Iran. Lapis lazuli, the mine that was most active during that time, was the mine that we mentioned in the Bronze Age slide, Shortugai in Afghanistan, in the Badashan Mountains. Cerec skins, and ceres refers to the Central Asian silk area, cotton cloth, and silk yarn. And then also indigo, which was used as a dye that also was brought back to the Roman Empire. That connection to silk suggests this trading route that was going north. So that's Babarikam. And then you have Barigaza, so imports, wine, Italian preferred. So those were just snobs, right? Barigaza, that was just, so. But you could get away with Laodicean and also some Arabian wine. Copper, tin, lead, coral, Mediterranean coral in particular, thin clothing, inferior sorts of all kinds, as if they were saying they don't know what they're buying. Bright colored girdles, a cubit wide, storax, sweet clover, flint glass, which is kind of raw glass, perhaps used for local production. Realgar, which is an arsenic, which is used in in medicine, and also as a dye. You have antimony, which is, in the modern world, we know it as the stuff you put in batteries that really kills you. That's what they were importing, apparently, in Barigaza. Gold and silver coin, yielding a profit on the exchange. And in the case of Barigaza, presumably because of the political situation right around the port city, you had to bring presents for the king. So in other words, it's a luxury tax, right? You want to trade your ware, you bring something for the political elites, and then they allow you access. Costly vessels of silver, slaves, singing boys, beautiful maidens for the harem, fine wines, so the king gets the fine wines, everybody else gets the inferior wine, thin clothing of the finest weave, and the choicest of ointments. So there were special consignments that were meant to provide access that needed to be brought in. Then exports, nard, this one comes from Scythia, costus, bdellium, ivory, agate, carnelian, lycium, and silk cloth. And that was the silk cloth coming from China, the overland routes, which were then bought up in the port cities and brought back. And pepper, long pepper in the case of Barigaza, because it came from the north, and black pepper. We talked about Muziris, because the south was known for the black pepper. So the Periplus is pretty clear how things connected, right? The Romans preferred the maritime route, simpler, easier to defend. You didn't have to deal with pesky middlemen or political entities whose lands you were traversing. You could build direct networks from the empire to, right, the cities on the west coast of India. Now, when you look at this, and Peter mentioned my interest in the Kushan period, this early 1st to 3rd century CE period. If you look at this map, it's very accurate. For the Kushans, this was their lucrative trade, right? Because they were positioned right between the markets in China and the markets further south that connected to the Roman trade, right? And in this map, you can see that as they expand, through this wealth brought about by these exchange networks, barbaricum becomes their main export. And that explains the silk too, because they were moving these Chinese products back and forth through the empire, right, over land. And in this map, the southern dynasties also had their direct routes. The maps don't completely coincide. The Satavahana Empire is fine. But the southern elites, Indian elites, also had their direct networks, and then networks that went to Southeast Asia. And that's how things were divided a bit in this early Common Era. So again, during the early Common Era, no large-scale activity overseas is noted in the Chinese sources. So it fits perfectly, right? Because the Chinese had not yet begun moving goods in large quantities to far-flung territories. The cross-cultural trade, I joke that every lecture I have to go back to Begram, because that's how it all started. I'm going to do it again. The 1st century CE or 2nd century CE site of Begram, right here, the Afghan territory of the Kushan Empire, revealed this wide array of materials, right, some of which were exhibited in the Asian Art Museum at the time of the Afghan exhibition, which included Chinese lacquer, Indian ivory, and also this Roman glassware. Now remember, right? The import of that Roman glassware in Barbaricum, it was moving from there straight up, right? One of the nodes was straight up through the Kushan Empire and then perhaps on to China. So Barbaricum, Barigaza, right? The trade came here from the Roman networks, then put on different caravans that were going overland and then on to China. Pericles knows about China, but it has no details about China. So there is evidence that the network that the author of the Pericles knew that the goods were going there. It just had no information on how they were going there, necessarily. So the Romans basically stopped, at the west coast of India and the southern coast of Pakistan. That's what was the extent of their network. And then Indians, Kushans, whoever they were, we really don't know about their ethnicity, the languages that they spoke, were moving that material through Central Asia and on to China. So we have a lot of information about the infrastructure, a lot of documentation about goods, commodities, movement, where they were moving, etc. And of course, it's interesting to think about what types of cultural exchanges ensued, right, with the movement of materials and the movement of mercantile communities. And I want to give the example of Tilla Tepe for two reasons. One, Tilla Tepe, of course, was also part of the famous Afghanistan exhibit at the Asian Art Museum. But two, this first century site really reveals the effects of cross-cultural trends on the art, the local arts of a region. If you all remember Tilla Tepe, I don't know how much you do, but it was a site in northern Afghanistan, excavated sometime in the 1970s, and the site consisted of 6 or 7 semi-pastoral nomadic burials with a lot of gold objects, and also traded commodities or goods. So just to give you a few examples, in those graves you find ivory combs that were thought to originate from India. You have a Han Dynasty mirror. You have gold coins of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, which allows us to place the site in the 1st century CE. But more than these sort of imported objects, right, trade goods, you have locally produced objects that show the signs of cross-fertilization. And again, we don't know exactly what that entails or the mechanisms for that. But if you look at most of the gold objects that seem to have been produced in one workshop, if you look at the technology that was employed, you can see Greco-Roman, right, motifs. This is labeled. We don't know what people thought of her in antiquity, but certainly the scholars who excavated her thought of her as Aphrodite, right? She's leaning on a pillar, she has that nude upper torso. But this is locally produced, right? You have these shoe buckles that were in the male grave, that on the costume of the male deceased, that show references to chariots that do not belong in the Central Asian world, that you really don't find. There seem to be bamboo-made, much more Chinese-looking chariots with a, not a rider, I don't know what do you do on a driver of a chariot, with a Chinese costume, wearing a Chinese costume. This ruler and dragon pendant shows Persian costume motifs, and also shows griffins with contorted hindquarters, which is very similar to pastoral nomadic animal style decoration. So what you find here is an amalgam of motifs that are over time somehow became blended and incorporated and became part of this cultural environment of Central Asia. Now, the other interesting thing to suggest about the trading network and cultural exchange, there were more than just pathways for goods. It was also along these networks that ideas spread, or ideas of other philosophies, religions moved. For example, and this becomes important, in particular its relation to trade, is the movement of Buddhism from its place of origin in India into Central Asia and China. In fact, if you map the archaeology of trade in Central Asia, you basically map the movement of Buddhism. You combine those two, and it is very clear how things moved to China. So not just because elites were favorably inclined, you probably needed those elites to be favorably inclined towards a new religion or a philosophy, but it's the support of the mercantile communities. And in particular, I think in this period where there's a lot of documentation about merchants gravitating towards Buddhism, that allowed Buddhism to move into Central Asia and then on to China. And again, this Wikipedia map shows kind of that route that Kushan merchants, whoever they were, took to China. You map Buddhism and it goes exactly that way as well, right? It kind of follows the trading network, either for protection, because of support, or somehow there was a symbiotic relationship that developed in the Kushan period between mercantile communities and the Buddhist tradition. That the Kushans were favorably inclined towards Buddhism is noted in their coins. One of the many deities or gods that they depicted on the reverse of their coins, was the first or the early images of the Buddha, right? Other pieces of evidence for the symbiotic relationship between Buddhism and trade is the titles that were assigned to the Buddha himself over time. So the Milindapana, or the Questions of King Milinda, which are actually an early text, the Buddha is referred to as the Mahasattvaha, or a great caravan leader, right? And that seems to suggest, right, this association, perhaps initiated from a Buddhist context, or perhaps initiated from the mercantile community, a gravitation towards this tradition. And not just overland. There is a text in Gandhari, so-called Gandhari Dharmapada, which was found in the northern territories, where there's a reference to the Buddha, or there's a sentence that reads, "The Buddha was a merchant of the great ocean." So not only the overland traders, but also mercantile seafaring mercantile communities were starting to gravitate towards Buddhism as well. One of the sources that I used a lot for the Kushan period, one of the Indian sources, because the Kushans themselves did not develop a kind of indigenous body of literature, but because part of their territories covered the Indic environment, you can Look at the Jataka Tales, for example. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Jataka Tales, the birth stories of the Buddha, or the stories of the Buddha's previous lives before he became Buddha in his last life, are many, many references to the trading communities. And these references suggest not only that the mercantile communities sponsored Buddhism, but that Buddhism protected the mercantile communities. So, for example, there are many stories that recount shipwrecks, right, or caravans where the merchants got in some kind of distress, and they called upon the Buddha in his previous, right, incarnation to help protect them from harm. So Buddhism, and again, I think describing it as a symbiotic relationship is accurate because they are kind of glued together in very interesting ways in this period. And you can go, to the Borobudur, you find visual representations, Ajanta as well, of these kinds of stories and visual representations of the mercantile communities. All right, so we're inching towards the Han Dynasty, right? We're moving from the west coast of India through Central Asia, through the Kushan period, to the Han Dynasty. The chronicles of the Han Dynasty, in particular the Hu-Hanshu chronicles, describe the routes to neighboring regions. And about 99% of those references, I would say, are to overland routes. And then there are a few that deal with the sea. There are specific references to silk as an export commodity. There are references to jade as an import commodity. But when you take the body of text at face value, then the Chinese were really moving their products overland. And what's interesting about it is that in ancient China, merchants were not moving far beyond Gansu. There are few references to diplomats and traders making individual journeys to the Near East and also trying to reach the Roman Empire. But most of the cargo overland was offloaded somewhere in Xinjiang and then taken up by Central Asians, best we can gauge, and then brought down to the port cities. There's an interesting work by John E. Hill. It's called Through the Jade Gate to Rome. And it's a study of the Silk Roads during the later Han dynasties, 1st to 2nd century CE. And it's annotated, so there's a lot of explanation about the terminology that occurs in those sources. So for example, when we think back on the Roman text that mentioned this one Roman Empire merchant who tried to reach Xinjiang, you have a few of these references in the Hu-Hanshu as well. So in the 1st century CE, there is a diplomat or an envoy that goes or tries to go to tries to go to the Roman Empire. So there's knowledge of it. He embarks on his journey, and he gets as far as Parthia, which is the Near East. Right? It's right to the west of the Kushan Empire. And there he's supposed to jump on a ship that will take him across the ocean to Egypt. According to the text, he unfortunately hears so many bad stories about the journey across the sea. So for example, that's the second part. The ocean is huge. Those making the round trip can do it in 3 months if the winds are favorable. However, if you encounter winds that will delay you, it can take up to 2 years. That's why all the men who go by sea take stores for 2 years. The vast ocean urges men to think of their country and get homesick, and some of them die. So that's the information that he gets, and he turns around and says, I don't need this. I'm going back. So there are a couple of those stories where there's knowledge, obviously, of maritime routes, but there's still a gravitation towards utilizing the overland routes and forgetting about the sea until much later. What about Roman Empire objects in the Han Dynasty? There are a few, not very many, that are sourced well. So again, based solely on archaeological evidence, it's difficult to fully comprehend how much material was coming in. But obviously the texts talk about a lot of silk moving west and Roman materials, Central Asian materials being imported. But on the ground, at least in situ, it's very difficult to build a corpus of material where you can say, hey, see, this reflects very well what was coming in. There are a couple of chance finds, a Dionysian plate with a grape motif here, a Dionysian scene was found in Gansu province. It's a silver plate. What's interesting about that plate, though, it has a later Sogdian inscription on it, inscribed. So maybe it came in early, or maybe it was brought in later by Sogdians, and then, you know, there's a reference to a name on the back. There's some of that Roman glass that was mentioned in the Periplus in southern sites in China, but again, some of that material is very fragile, right? It's hard to find glass, in particular glass that is intact, unless it's in a tomb, for example. So again, we don't know how often and how intensive this penetrated into ancient Han society among the elites. At least archaeologically, we don't have enough, I think, documentation. But if you put it together with what the Romans were bringing in, then one could at least hypothesize that a lot of this material was moving on well into China, as referenced in some of the textual sources. We know one thing about Central Asia, perhaps not necessarily of goods originating in the Roman Empire, that jade continued to be a very valuable resource. And some scholars even look at the expansion starting in the Han, but later in the Tang, you know, as having economic reasons to safeguard and extend economic as well as political power into the region. Another source that we use, of course, is how often in Silk Road studies, people suggest that it all began with the envoy that was dispatched by Emperor Wudi to Central Asia to seek an alliance with the Yuezhi pastoral nomadic confederacy against the Xiongnu. He's not successful in that he is not able to get an agreement with the Yuezhi, but what he brings back is knowledge in the 2nd century BCE, in the early Han period, of all the products that you can find in Central Asia. So for example, he writes about Bactria, the size of it, who rules the area, and then he talks about some, the mercantile commodities and the trade that occurs in this region. Another reference, and I want to make sure I keep to the time, is the document called The Peoples of the West, which also reveals some information about what China knew in the 3rd century CE about the Romans. Again, passages describe the route, right? They have some interesting references about political dimensions. So for example, this last passage, they have always wanted to communicate, the Romans, with China directly, but Parthia, jealous of their profits, would not allow them to pass overland to China. And then one other passage is very interesting. Furthermore, they regularly make a profit by obtaining Chinese silk, unraveling it, and making fine Western silk damasks. This is why this country trades with Parthia across the middle of the sea. The seawater is bitter and unable to be drunk. This is why rare for those who try to make contact to reach China. There's another little tidbit about silk and silk moving from China to the Roman Empire. Some of it must have moved as a finished product, right? Woven into particular patterns. But there's some indication from the textual sources that not everyone liked those patterns, and that they tried, or at least the Chinese perceived them, or the Chinese writers perceived them, as trying to unravel the silk and make their own, right, according to their own patterns. I've always have a hard time imagining that myself, because I think if anybody has like a silk, textile or something at home and you try to unravel that, that's not going to work. So I'm wondering, but I'll show you an interesting example. How am I doing on time? Oh, can I show you just that one example? I have way too many slides. Sorry, I could go on for hours. So one place where you can find Chinese silk is Palmyra, right? Silk, again, it doesn't survive burial, right, very well. It's very fragile commodity, so you'd be hard-pressed to find it. So again, archaeological evidence, the records say there's a lot, but archaeological evidence says, well, where? Where is it? Again, causing some scholars to doubt the intensity, the frequency, and also the size of some of these trading activities that are mentioned. So Palmyra became very, very wealthy also due to trade in the 1st to 3rd century CE. Not only overland, but they also had their own port at Charax. Now, if the Romans utilized this, the Palmyrans controlled the Persian Gulf. So they were actually parallel to the Romans, conducting overland trade and also sea trade. The reason why I had wanted to talk about the Palmyrines is that they are a quintessential mercantile community. It's one of the few instances in that period where you actually have a mercantile class. Chinese sources rarely reference merchants. It's almost as if it's a parasitic occupation and you really shouldn't be dealing in profit. And the same goes for Romans too. There's a little reluctance. And if you look at India, merchants certainly weren't part of the upper castes of India as well. But Palmyra, merchants had statues. Merchants were mentioned by name. They were a class that contributed to the wealth of Palmyra, and they were honored, and they were in positions of political power. All of Palmyra, you have these reliefs that depict the merchant. There's an inscription by name, and also the animals, the camels that were utilized in overland trade. Not only did the Palmyrans deal in Palmyra itself, they also had diaspora mercantile communities all along the routes in Mesopotamia and also at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. And not only did they have diaspora communities working on behalf of the financiers back home, they also had their own army which protected their trade. So in Dura Europos, for example, this very famous site, you have murals of Palmyrene soldiers that are there basically as garrisons to protect that trade. Some more images. I don't have time, which is very, very annoying. Happens to me all the time in teaching too. I'm way too optimistic at the beginning, and then it turns out that it just doesn't work. The public square, the Agora in Palmyra, had statues, representations of merchants by name. This was the central marketplace in Palmyra. And there's a huge limestone inscription, which basically is the Palmyrene tax law, right? They just wrote it out, what was coming in, how much would be charged or levied on those goods coming in. It's a very detailed account. And you don't have very many instances of this in this period, this early Common Era period. So in Palmyra, you again get this sense of the lucrative nature of this network. The amount of tax goes by the load. So let's see. Camel load, you also had a donkey load. So camel load, probably bigger than the donkey load. So it was by weight and amount that it got taxed. The inscriptions in the hypogea, or the underground burial sites, also list merchants by name. I'm sorry I can't talk about this. It was so much fun. But I come to the last. This is the silk fragment from Palmyra. And again, I go back to my notation that it's hard to imagine this unraveling. Turns out, they did a scientific analysis of this textile. And indeed, the silk is Chinese, but the representation is not. Giving some credence to the reference, right? It is possible then that this occurred perhaps on a regular basis. I do, however, also want to go back to the list that I mentioned of exports, Barbaricum. It did read silk yarn, right? So it is possible that the raw material also was then, right, utilized. So that's also a possibility. This was found in the hypogeum, so in a burial. One of the deceased was wrapped partially in silk. And there were a number of other fragments that were found in Palmyra very early on, before the war, that clearly have Han Dynasty motifs. So there was silk yarn, there were exports, and then perhaps there was some unraveling occurring as well in Palmyra. All right, I was going to move on to the Sogdians, but I was going to move on to the Sogdians, then I was going to move on to the Arabs and the Persians, and I barely made it out. I barely made it through the early Common Era, so I apologize for my optimism. But in fact, I think it's actually turned out to be, it worked out eventually, because I think, perhaps you now have a better sense of the overland and maritime routes of that early period of the development of the trading networks. So thank you very much.